Siamo ritornati con il nostro programma, questo seminario di aggiornamento in critica testuale, e vi presento il dottor Miika Tucker. Allora, Miika Tucker è un ricercatore dell'Università di Helsinki, fa la sua ricerca postdoc in Helsinki, in Finlandia, e fra le sue pubblicazioni cito la sua tesi dottorale uscita di recente, The Septuagint of Geremia, a Study in Translation Technique and Recensions, di 2022. Miika Tucker attualmente è il successore di Richard Weiss come curatore del volume del BHQ per Geremia. Lui è anche responsabile per il commentario alla 70 di Geremia nella collana della SBL in collaborazione con la IOSCS, ancora in preparazione. Come già informato, la relazione sarà in inglese, ma avete a disposizione il testo, la traduzione in italiano. So, without further ado, I'd like to give the word to Dr. Miika Tucker.
Okay, thank you, Leonardo, for that kind introduction, and I'm very honored to be here, and I thank the organizers for inviting me, Father Ska and Leonardo, and also I understand Professor Ciuntoli was the organizer also. Here. Okay, thank you for noting that. If you can't hear, just wave your hands and I'll try to speak louder. Professor Tov in the morning on Monday, he said he was sorry he couldn't bring the weather with him from Jerusalem. I am the opposite. I'm happy I didn't bring the weather with me from Finland. It's very much colder and lots of more snow there, so I've enjoyed the sunshine while I was here. But the text of Jeremiah. In this lecture, I'll survey the textual sources of Jeremiah to understand their character as textual witnesses to the text, and I will briefly go over the history of research on Jeremiah in order to understand the developing consensus on its textual history. Then we will look at how the evidential reality of the 21st century has led to new approaches to the textual history of Jeremiah that more accurately conform to the textual witnesses. Much of what I present is relevant for the study of the books of the Bible in general, but I will try to show how the concepts and ideas apply to Jeremiah in particular. The evidence for the textual history of the book of Jeremiah is very complex. This is because the text has been transmitted in two exceptionally different versions, which are the Hebrew Masoretic text and the Greek Septuagint. The major differences consist of the quantity and the arrangement of the text. The Septuagint lacks a representation of over 3,000 words in the Masoretic text, which amounts to 1/7 of the text. This equals about 16 pages out of the 116 pages in the BHS edition of Jeremiah. The oracles against the nations are located at the end of the book in the Masoretic text, while the Septuagint locates them in the middle of the book. Now we'll look at a few examples of these differences real quick. So first, some examples of the quantitative differences between the two editions, between the Hebrew Masoretic text and the Greek Septuagint. A lot of the differences consist of very short snippets of text, one or two words or phrases, and very rarely are they larger portions of text. And Emmanuel Tov has written a few articles where he categorizes these differences very conveniently because they seem to share a lot of features between themselves. So I have here 4 types of of differences, quantitative differences. The first is headings to oracles, and these are found a few times in the Masoretic text, where before the oracle begins, the Hebrew text will have a short extra portion of text that is lacking in the Septuagint. So in the Septuagint you have kai epen tade lege kyrios, which is in English saying, "Thus says the Lord." But the Hebrew text has this bold part of the text in front of this. "The word of the Lord came to me, saying, Go and proclaim in the hearing of Jerusalem." In the second category I have here as an example is new details. This is basically information that is nowhere else found in the book. That's why it's categorized as new details. So, for example, in the beginning of chapter 25, both the Hebrew and the Greek begin the verse, "The word that came to Jeremiah concerning all the people of Judah in the 4th year of King Jehoiakim, son of Josiah of Judah." And the Greek stops there and continues in verse 2. But the Hebrew adds some new detail, and that's the date, the equivalent date for the king of Babylon, the 1st year of King Nebuchadrezzar of Babylon. A third type of difference is explanatory additions, and these are basically small bits of information that explain further something that is mentioned earlier. So both the Hebrew and the Greek texts have part of this chapter 36 in verse 6. This is a story where Jeremiah writes on the scroll and Baruch the scribe goes to read to the king. So Jeremiah tells Baruch, "So you go and you shall read the words of the Lord from the scroll." Then the Septuagint continues, "in the hearing of the people in the Lord's house." The Hebrew Masoretic text has a little bit more information on the scroll. It specifies that it's the scroll that you have written at my dictation. So the scroll that Baruch has written when Jeremiah dictated it to him. And then another type of difference, which is probably the most prominent and best known in Jeremiah. The Masoretic text has more personal names, patronyms, and titles than the Greek Septuagint. So example is in chapter 21, verse 2. The Greek text only has, "The king of Babylon is making war against us." The Hebrew text adds the name of the king, Nebuchadrezzar. And then chapter 28, verse 5, example where the names Jeremiah and Hananiah occur in the Greek text, but the Hebrew text adds the titles, who these people are, Jeremiah the prophet and Hananiah the prophet. And then the arrangement of the text. So on the left column, I have presented the Hebrew Masoretic text, and the right column is the arrangement of the Greek text. Both texts begin with chapters 1 through 24, oracles against Judah and Jerusalem. Both texts have chapter 25, the first verses through verse 13. But then the Masoretic text continues from there with the cup of wrath sequence, which is a judgment against Jerusalem and the nations. Then it gives a long narrative about the fall of Jerusalem and the refugees who are fleeing to Egypt. And after that comes the oracles against the nations in the Hebrew text. And finally, the chapter 52, the destruction of Jerusalem. In the Septuagint, on the other hand, the oracles come right there in the middle of the book, in the middle of chapter 25, actually. And then only after that you have the text on the cup of wrath, where also there's oracles of judgment against Jerusalem and the nations. And then you have the long narrative, and after that comes the chapter 52, destruction of Jerusalem. But not only the location of the oracles, but the arrangement of the oracles is different in the two versions. On the left again is the Hebrew Masoretic text. You see it's nicely has bookends with the most powerful nations, the bigger nations, Egypt at the beginning and Babylon at the end. You have Moab in the middle with the yellow color, and the second to last nation is Elam here on green. The Septuagint, on the other hand, begins with Elam. And the most powerful ones are after that, Egypt and Babylon. And then the last nation is Moab. But also the shorter oracles against these other nations are also in a bit different order. These differences have puzzled scholars at least since the time of Origen, and the common consensus until the end of the 20th century was that the Masoretic text reflects the more original form of the text than the Septuagint. The discovery and publication of the Dead Sea Scrolls has revolutionized the way scholars understand the textual history of the Hebrew Bible, and Jeremiah is no exception. Since the turn of the century, the consensus has shifted, and scholars now realize that the traditional approaches to the text of Jeremiah are no longer compatible with the actual evidence of the text. Throughout most of its history, research on the text of Jeremiah has had access to only one form of Hebrew source text, the Masoretic text. The other witnesses to the Hebrew text that have been the usual translations from antiquity: the Greek Septuagint, the Aramaic Targum, the Latin Vulgate, and the Syriac Peshitta. With regard to the text of Jeremiah, these witnesses may be essentially divided into two groups. The Masoretic text, the Targum, the Peshitta, and the Vulgate all attest to and derive from a similar text form, in other words, the Proto-Masoretic text, while the Septuagint attests a radically different text form. Consequently, text-critical research on Jeremiah has focused on the differences that the Septuagint attests in comparison to the Hebrew text, and competing theories on the history of the text have revolved around these two witnesses. Before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, Septuagint Jeremiah was not considered to be as important of a text-critical witness as the Masoretic text, because it was a translation, and scholars usually dismissed its variant readings as free or arbitrary translation. The Qumran caves held Jeremiah scrolls that attest both the text forms of the Masoretic text and the text form of the Septuagint, and this has elevated the text-critical value of the Septuagint among scholars to the point that it is now necessary to take the Septuagint into account when formulating a history of the text of Jeremiah. The main sources for the Masoretic text are from the Middle Ages, and the oldest complete texts are those of Codex Leningradensis and the Aleppo Codex. However, the consonantal text that it transmits is very old and dates back to the Second Temple period. Its text is already attested in a few fragmentary Jeremiah manuscripts that have been discovered. These are 2Q Jeremiah, 4Q Jeremiah A, C, and E. The Masoretic text of Jeremiah has a low incidence of haplography and a high incidence of conflation, which can be seen in comparison to the Septuagint. And these are strong indications of the developed nature of the text through recensional activity and very broad transmission. Ample recensional activity leads to conflated readings, and broad transmission helps eliminate haplographical mistakes from the manuscript tradition. The Vulgate, Peshitta, and Targum translations of Jeremiah all have their own translation characters, but they all seem to translate Vorlagen that are similar in form to that of the Masoretic text. A distinguishing feature of the Targum translation is its use of paraphrase to convey the meaning of the Hebrew text. This is realized through interpretation, commentary, supplying of missing details, and making precise of what might appear vague, and by the introduction of Aggadah. Two of the main concerns of the Targum translator in Jeremiah are reverence for God and for his people, Israel. And if there are any words that offend these principles or that lack piety, the translator will neutralize these. The Peshitta, on the other hand, is considered a literal translation, but a number of non-literal features are employed in order to make the translation intelligible and to eliminate logical imprecision. These features include modifying the sense of the Hebrew text, increasing its precision, varying lexical equivalence, and resorting to Syriac syntactical constructions and idioms at the expense of Hebrew constructions and idioms. The Vulgate also follows the text form of the Masoretic text very closely, with only minor variation. Consistent semantic and syntactic equivalence, for example, nouns translate nouns and verbs translate verbs. There's stylistic preference for formal variety, and it therefore varies its equivalence to a certain extent. I'll spend more time discussing the Septuagint. Jeremiah was translated into Greek, likely during the 2nd century BCE in Egypt, and it has been described as the most complex book in the Septuagint. This statement refers to three aspects of research on the translation, all of which relate to its textual history. First is the large quantitative differences in the different arrangement of the text, the markedly different text type from that conveyed in the Masoretic tradition. Second, there are significant differences in the translation equivalents employed in the two halves of the translation, and these have led to questions concerning the unity of the translation. Specifically, whether more than one person was involved in producing the text that has been transmitted in the manuscripts. And third, the translation character of the book is generally characterized as literal and isomorphic, and yet a degree of variation and free translation can be detected as well. Because of this complexity, comparing the Greek and Hebrew text for text-critical purposes requires methodological acumen to distinguish between three main factors that affect the translation. First is the Hebrew Vorlage. The second factor is the requirements of the target language, Greek. And third, the peculiarities of the translator. When we encounter a variant between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint, we must ask which of these factors is responsible for the variant. In some cases, more than one factor might be involved, and we'll return to this question later in the lecture. Early assessments of the translation character of Septuagint Jeremiah concentrated on the differences between the Greek and the Hebrew texts, and on the quantitative differences in particular. These assessments stemmed from inquiries into the text-critical value of Septuagint Jeremiah, and oftentimes their description of its translation character reflects issues of textual criticism more so than translation character. This is evident, for example, in Karl Heinrich Graf's description of the translation from 1862. He describes it as a mutilated and corrupt text and blames the following differences on the translator: both the short and long minuses in the Septuagint, the changed subjects of the verbs, inexact and incorrect renderings, small and large transpositions, the misinterpretation of proper nouns, and the confusion and false vocalization of consonants. Such early assessments did not miss their mark completely. Each scholar makes a number of important remarks regarding the translation and how it reflects its Vorlage. But when it comes to the quantitative differences between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint, they mostly dismiss them as the translator's tendency to abbreviate the text. This approach of not distinguishing between translation technical and text critical aspects of the translation labels nearly all research on Septuagint Jeremiah that is dated before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the early 20th century, Henry St. John Thackeray made the first clear forays into describing the translation character of books in the Septuagint, apart from their text critical value. This development places more emphasis on the quantitative agreements between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint, which allows a more focused concentration on the nature of the translation and how the translator moved from his source text to the translated product. The most common assessment of the character of the Greek translation of Jeremiah is that it is a literal translation. In particular, this refers to its isomorphic character. In other words, it consistently represents each element or word of its Hebrew Vorlage, and it consistently preserves the word order of the Vorlage. This pertains to even the smallest elements of the text, for example, suffixes, articles, and prepositions. The translator's intention to faithfully represent his Vorlage is most evident in his representation of Hebrew words that he clearly did not understand. He often passes syntactical difficulties on to the readers, and he frequently uses transcription for words that he does not understand. He occasionally resorts to double translation when he is unsure of the meaning of a word or a phrase. The choice of translation equivalents is mostly consistent in Septuagint Jeremiah, but not stereotypical. The translator varies his equivalents according to context, and a particular characteristic of Septuagint Jeremiah is the sudden change of preferred equivalents in the middle of the translation. These changes in equivalents mostly display the characteristics of early revisions of the Septuagint, and it is highly likely that the second half of Septuagint Jeremiah is a revision of the Old Greek translation. Some aspects of free translation are identifiable in the Septuagint Jeremiah. These occur mostly within the confines of the general isomorphic character of the translation and do not occur often in the text. Andrew Sheed has called these discourse literalism, by which he means that the translator can depart from consistency on the word level while maintaining consistency on the level of discourse, in other words, the sentence level. Examples of this include the surprisingly frequent use of genitivus absolutus to render the temporal be plus infinitive Hebrew constructions, and the use of reverse translation in resolving rhetorical questions. Some aspects of free translation do not warrant the notion such aspects of free translation do not warrant the notion that the translator performed the extensive editorial changes that are evident in the differences between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint of Jeremiah. The literal nature of the translation rather suggests that the translator used a Vorlage that already bore these differences. Nevertheless, the fact that the Septuagint, which is the only complete witness to the shorter text, was a Greek translation, this fact dissuaded scholars from accepting this approach to Septuagint Jeremiah. It was only after the discovery and publication of variant Hebrew manuscripts that the majority of scholars began to accept the Septuagint as a witness to a variant Hebrew text of Jeremiah. So now let's look at the Dead Sea Scrolls evidence. Two scrolls, 4Q Jeremiah B and 4Q Jeremiah D, attest a Hebrew text that agrees with the Septuagint in its length and arrangement. Though these are fragmentary scrolls, they clearly depict the features that distinguish the Septuagint from the Masoretic text. 4Q Jeremiah B attests the section from chapter 9 verse 22 to chapter 10 verse 21. This portion of text is particularly important for the textual history of Jeremiah because both the length and arrangement of the text differ in the Septuagint and in the Masoretic text. 4Q Jeremiah D attests chapter 43 verses 1 through 2, and it lacks the titles and patronyms that are attested in the Masoretic text. And I think Professor Tove in his lecture had an example of this fragment 4Q Jeremiah D on Monday. At least the text of his presentation included it. So we will only look at 4Q Jeremiah B in this lecture. 4Q Jeremiah B contains a judgment against idolatry, including a vivid description of how idols are made. A similar description is found in Isaiah 44, verse 9 through 20. The order of the verses is different in the two versions, in the Septuagint and in 4Q Jeremiah B. The order follows in chapter 10, it has verse 4, then verse 5a, the beginning, and then verse 9, and then verse 5b. I'll show you a reconstruction in a moment. And after 5b, you have verse 11. So verses 6, 7, 8, and 10 are completely lacking in the Septuagint and in 4Q Jeremiah B. And these verses contain a complete doxology in the Masoretic text. So here you can see a picture of the fragment. The verses we are looking at are on lines 5, 6, and 7. These are the verses I was talking about. And you notice that you can see the end of the column here. So that helps with the reconstruction. And on the left you have Professor Eugene Ulrich's reconstruction of this or transcription of this fragment from the DJD volume. So here I have a English translation of the reconstruction. It looks like the lines have jumped a little bit in the PowerPoint, but nonetheless the red font is what you see on the fragment, and the black font is the reconstructed part. So you can clearly see that you have a portion of verse 4, and then on the next line you have a portion of verse 9, and the next line is a portion of verse 11. Based on the fragment, the scholars have determined that the lines on this scroll are very long, so you have lots of space for text between the lines, I mean on the lines. But still, since verse 4 and verse 9 are on lines 5 and 6, there's no way to have space for verses 5, 6, 7, and 8. That's 4 verses, and there's only enough space for maybe 2 or 3 verses at the most on each line. So to make the reconstruction, you have to determine which verses are there between line 5 and 6. If you look at the Septuagint, you only have verse 5a between verses 4 and 9. So I think the editors looked at the Septuagint to make this reconstruction, and they determined that verse 5a is here between verses 4 and 9, and that fits the reconstruction of the scroll. So they concluded that that is the best reconstruction. Now in line 7, you could maybe have verse 10 here instead of 5b, but since line 6 is most likely similar to the Septuagint, then it's very likely that line 7 also is the text similar to the Septuagint, so they have reconstructed verse 5b here on line 7 as well. The discovery and publication of the Dead Sea Scrolls was a turning point in the textual history of Jeremiah, just as it has been for the rest of the Hebrew Bible. This is reflected in major methodological shifts that are necessitated by the evidence of the scrolls, particularly with regard to how the different literary evidence is taken into account. And we'll look at 3 developments that I think are necessary for understanding the textual history of Jeremiah. And this is text criticism and literary criticism. Secondly, the relationship between textual criticism of the Hebrew text, textual criticism of the Greek text, and the translation character of the Greek text. And finally, also translation technique of Septuagint Jeremiah. First of all, text historical methodology has consciously sought to distinguish between changes made to the text during its composition and changes made during its transmission, based on the assumption that the transmission began only after composition was complete. This has been the axiom for applying the methods of literary criticism and textual criticism at different stages of textual analysis. Literary criticism was first applied to determine the stages of textual growth in the text, and only then was textual criticism applied to determine the transmissional changes that took place. For Jeremiah, this meant that the Masoretic text alone was used as the basis for literary critical analysis, and the Septuagint was seen to be useful only for determining text critical variants. Some have even argued that literary critical analysis should not have to rely on the Septuagint text. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have texts that prove this assumption to be wrong, and Jeremiah is one of the books that emphatically shows this to be the case. A variant Hebrew text that reflects the form of the Septuagint tells us that even after the text began to be transmitted, circulated, and translated, another form of it was still undergoing composition. Furthermore, comparing the Masoretic text and the Septuagint of Jeremiah reveals that without the textual evidence of the Septuagint, it would be impossible to determine which words and phrases have been added to the text. Literary critical analyses of Jeremiah that only refer to the Masoretic text have proven to be products of their own time that reflect literary and hermeneutical ideals that prevailed during the lifetime of their authors. One cannot project contemporary understandings of literature and genre backwards in time and expect that the scribes of antiquity complied with them. The traditional distinction between literary criticism and textual criticism is arbitrary and does not explain the textual evidence of Jeremiah. Given the complexity of Jeremiah, particularly the unique nature of the Septuagint version, a new methodology is necessary that combines literary and textual criticism, and that takes all the textual evidence into account to reconstruct the whole textual history of Jeremiah and not just the transmissional stage. The next issue is how to take the evidence of the Septuagint into account, since it is a translation and not a Hebrew text. The aim of reconstructing the history of the Hebrew text requires the reconstruction of the Greek text as well. That is, what kind of recensional activity has the Greek text undergone, and what kind of text did the initial translator produce? In the case of Jeremiah, as in other books, the many Greek manuscripts reflect different text types that are the result of recensional activity that occurred during its transmission. Joseph Ziegler has convincingly identified the Lucianic and hexaplerik readings found in the Septuagint tradition of Jeremiah, in the manuscripts. But the critical text most likely does not exactly depict the original translation, the Old Greek translation, as recent research suggests that Septuagint Jeremiah was revised at such an early point in the text, such an early point in time, that the revision has permeated all surviving Greek manuscripts. Textual criticism of the Greek text will therefore take us close to the Old Greek translation, but in order to go further to the Hebrew Forlage, that was the base of this translation, we also need to take the translation character of the translation into account. Translation technique is a method that helps determine what type of translation we are dealing with and what kinds of decisions the translator made when he made his translation. This is done by comparing the Hebrew text and the Greek text to see how the Greek text represents the words, phrases, sentences, and different linguistic elements of the text. Based on an understanding of the translator's work and decisions, we may back-translate to the Hebrew Forlage. Especially for the book of Jeremiah, for which the Masoretic text and the Septuagint vary to such a significant extent, textual criticism is a necessary factor to take into consideration when undertaking a translation technical study. When progressing toward evaluating the translation character, it is important to establish the Hebrew Forlage and the Old Greek text. And one must always be very wary of falling into circular reasoning. These three disciplines are interconnected, are an interconnected triangle of mutual dependence. In order to practice one of these, you have to take into account the other two as well. And this is the case particularly for Jeremiah. There is no predetermined sequence in which these three processes are to be carried out. They are mutually dependent on each other and should all be taken into consideration when performing each analysis. The particular text to be analyzed should be taken as the determining factor in deciding which step to carry out first. Generally speaking, the analysis of unquestionable readings and translation forms should form the basis for such research, after which uncertain readings and translations can be examined to complete the characterization of the translation. This interconnected trio of disciplines cannot function if the translation character of Jeremiah is not analyzed properly. Prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, most evaluations of the character of Septuagint Jeremiah did not distinguish between text-critical aspects of the translation and its translation technical aspects, as we discussed earlier. Scholars mainly focused their characterizations of the translation on the major differences between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint. And this naturally led to the assumption that the translator abbreviated and mutilated the text by leaving out the portions that had no representation in the Greek manuscripts. A proper approach to translation technique necessitates the distinction between text critical aspects and translation technical aspects of the translation. For Jeremiah, this is crucial, and it was first stated in clear terms by Hermann Josef Stipp in the 1990s. This distinction is attained through analyzing sections of translation that do have a clear representation of the Hebrew text. This approach has been the usual one as a result of the Dead Sea Scroll findings, and it has led to a more realistic understanding of the type of translation that Septuagint Jeremiah is. The method of translation technique has been developed since the mid-20th century, led by Ilmari Soisalon-Soininen and his students at the University of Helsinki. There are three main factors that affect the translation of each book in the Septuagint, and the aim of translation technique is to determine how much each factor affects the translation. These factors are the Hebrew Vorlage of the translation, the target language, which is Greek in this case, and the translator himself. The effect of the Vorlage on the translation refers to how much the translation displays the linguistic characteristics of the Vorlage, that is, the Hebrew words, syntax, grammatical forms, and word order. This factor has a very strong effect on Septuagint Jeremiah. It basically reproduces the Hebrew syntax and word order, and it is very careful to give a representation of each linguistic element in the Hebrew text. The factor of the Greek language refers to how much the grammar and idioms of the Greek language affect the translation. Hebrew and Greek are two very different languages. Hebrew is a Semitic language and Greek an Indo-European language. This factor is directly related to the previous one because when the influence of the Vorlage is stronger, the influence of the target language is weaker. And this is the case for Jeremiah, for example. Greek word order is rarely followed in Jeremiah, and Greek idioms are rarely used. However, there are a few exceptions regarding Greek idioms that are featured in Septuagint Jeremiah. It's exceptional in the Septuagint for its use of genitivus absolutus constructions. This construction is found a few times in some of the translations that are considered better translations, such as Genesis, but it is usually not used in literal translations. But Jeremiah is considered one of the literal translations, and it attests this genitivus absolutus a total of 5 times, which is very unusual. Finally, the factor of the translator himself is very important because the peculiarities of each translator leave their mark on the translations and help us distinguish the different features of each translator. This factor can include a variety of different features, ranging from grammatical and syntactical renderings to word choices and theological or exegetical renderings. This factor can tell us about the interests and ideas of the translator. The two halves of Septuagint Jeremiah reflect this factor in different ways. In the first half, chapters 1 through 28, this factor is more subtle. The translator is careful to follow his Vorlage, but bears a certain degree of freedom in varying his lexical choices. This variation reveals that he is willing to part from the usual equivalents in order to present the meaning of the Hebrew text more accurately. A good example of this is the occasional use of the Greek particle de, instead of the usual kai, to render the Hebrew conjunction. The second half of the translation, chapters 29 through 52, display a number of features similar to the Kaige tradition. Examples include the consistent use of certain Kaige equivalents, a stronger tendency to use stereotyped equivalents, a much lesser degree of variation to suit the context, and a number of theological and exegetical equivalents. Based on this characterization of Septuagint Jeremiah, a few conclusions can be drawn about the textual history of the Hebrew text of Jeremiah. As stated earlier, the translation character of a translation describes how the translator worked and what kinds of decisions he made. On the other hand, we can also deduce what kinds of decisions he would not make for his translation. A literal translation such as Jeremiah strongly indicates that the translator was keen on producing a translation that exactly reproduces an equivalent of each Hebrew word of the Hebrew Methodological. This characterization excludes the possibility that the translator would alter the text by omitting the extra words, phrases, and entire verses that are attested in the Masoretic text. This observation and the witness of the Dead Sea Scrolls form strong proof that Septuagint Jeremiah was indeed translated from a Hebrew Methodological that was different from the Masoretic text. This second conclusion relates to the development of the Hebrew text and is based on different translation characters of the two halves of Septuagint Jeremiah, particularly the Kaiga type features in the second half of the translation. The Old Greek translation was most likely made in the 2nd century BC in Egypt. The Kaiga features attested in the second half of the translation suggest that the translation was revised according to the principles of the Kaiga tradition. Most scholars argue that the Kaiga revisers were based in the land of Israel, possibly in Jerusalem, and that the Kaiga revisions took place around the turn of the era, the 1st century BCE or CE. This would place the revision of Septuagint Jeremiah over a century later than the Old Greek translation and in a different geographical location. It is very likely that the reviser's Hebrew Methodological had developed further from the Methodological used by the initial translator in Egypt, and this would have given the reviser a strong motive to make a revision. In addition, the revision still does not display the many extra words, phrases, and verses that are attested in the Masoretic text. The Kaiga revisions of other Septuagint books usually reflect a Methodological similar to the Masoretic text, but the Methodological of Jeremiah's revision must be different from the Masoretic text. Taking into account all these methodological shifts that have taken place as a result of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, how can one describe the relationship between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint of Jeremiah? What is the nature of the differences and how do they reflect on the textual history of Jeremiah? First, a large portion of the pluses in the Masoretic text are very similar to one another in nature. That is, they are explications of implicit information that occurs already elsewhere in the text. And we looked at some of the examples of these at the beginning of the lecture. These similarities are highly indicative of a literary nature, which means that they were most likely created as intentional insertions by one or more editors as the text was transmitted. This implies that these variants should not be treated separately as incidental textual variants, but they should rather be seen to constitute a separate form or edition of the book. A similar conclusion can be drawn regarding the arrangement of the Masoretic text and the Septuagint. First, shared redactional features of the pluses in chapter 25 in the Masoretic text and the placement of the oracles against the nations at the end of the book posit a close redactional connection between the two. implying that the addition of text and the rearrangement of the book share a similar motive. Second, small details in the latter half of the book presuppose the oracles against the nation as antecedent. In other words, there are references to the oracles that indicate that they occurred earlier in the book rather than at the end. Third, the close contextual relationship between Jeremiah 25 and the oracles against the nations imply that the original location of the oracles is in connection to Jeremiah 25. These shared details between the location of the oracles and the quantitative pluses in the Masoretic text imply that the two are connected to each other and that they were made by the same scribes. So, with the understanding of the nature of the textual witnesses of Jeremiah and how they relate to each other, it's possible to depict their relationship in a diagram. Though a diagram cannot convey all the complexity of the textual history of Jeremiah, and this diagram here certainly oversimplifies it, it is helpful to have a visual example of how the text might have developed. This model here is based on a recent publication by Justus Gormley, and it pictures the shorter version of Jeremiah, of Septuagint Jeremiah, and the longer version of the Masoretic text as parallel developments that derive from a common source. On this chart, the boxes with solid borders indicate manuscript evidence, actual evidence, and the boxes with dashed borders indicate hypothetical sources. The arrows indicate the direction of change. At the very top, the hypothetical sources A, B, and C are the traditional source material of which Jeremiah is thought to be composed. A is used to indicate poetry, B indicates narrative sections, and C indicates prose sermons, which are usually Deuteronomistic in nature. At some point, these three sources were combined to produce the ancestor of the literary work that now constitutes the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah N at the top there. It is impossible to say how many generations of Jeremiah N were produced before the Forlage of the Greek translation took form, and further before the Forlage of the Masoretic text took form, which is here and also here. There seems to be a common ancestor for the Masoretic text for 2Q Jeremiah and 4Q Jeremiah A, C, and E. On the other hand, 4Q Jeremiah B and 4Q Jeremiah D show similarities with the Septuagint, which is G in this map. G for Greek. So 4Q Jeremiah B and D likely derive from the Forlage of the Greek translation as well, or a similar text. Since these fragments are so fragmentary, it is difficult to tell whether or not they indicate features of another source or not. The other notable translations of the Hebrew text, that is, the Latin Vulgate, the Syriac Peshitta, and the Aramaic Targum, all seem to be translated from a text that is similar to the Masoretic text. The different versions of Jeremiah that are attested in the textual evidence present challenges to the two critical editions of Jeremiah that are in preparation for publication, the Biblia Hebraica Quinta and the Hebrew Bible, a critical edition. Before concluding, I will briefly comment on how these editions intend to present the complex textual history of Jeremiah. Biblia Hebraica Quinta is a diplomatic edition that will present the variants of the shorter text of Jeremiah in the apparatus. The main text reproduces the Masoretic text according to Codex Leningradensis, and the apparatus will include a characterization of each variant that conveys the editor's opinion of the origin of the variant and its place in the textual history of Jeremiah. BHQ has adopted a characterization called literary variant, which indicates readings that represent a different tradition or edition of a biblical book than the one represented by the Masoretic text. A large portion of the minuses in the shorter text will be characterized as literary variants because a majority of the pluses in the Masoretic text share distinct literary features with one another. This solution acknowledges the shorter version of Jeremiah, but unlike the other categories of characterization, it does not provide information on the variant's place in the textual history of the book. It does not describe the underlying ideological cause of the variant, and it does not comment on the priority of the readings. Though this is a practical solution, it is problematic because it maintains the distinction between literary criticism and textual criticism, and it leaves the actual explanation of the textual history to the introduction and to the commentary, where the editor may clearly express his or her understanding of what happened to the text. The Hebrew Bible, a critical edition, aims to produce an eclectic critical text that will reconstruct the earliest inferable text based on the evidence. In principle, this means that the editor will create a main text based on the readings that he or she determines to be the earliest ones. In an extreme case, this would allow a text that reflects the form of Septuagint Jeremiah and relegate the many literary additions attested by the Masoretic text to the critical apparatus. This too, however, would be problematic in Jeremiah, since not all pluses in the Masoretic text can be clearly defined as secondary readings. A practical solution for HBCE, which has already been suggested and tested in a publication, is to produce two columns of text, one critical text for the longer version of Jeremiah and one critical text for the shorter version of Jeremiah. In such a case, the critical apparatus and the introduction would be reserved for the editor to express his or her conclusion regarding the priority of readings. So it seems that our understanding of the nature and definition of literary works strongly influences how we present the text of scripture books in critical editions. Much has changed already in the 20th century, and with the ongoing study of the revolutionary discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, I expect much to change in the 21st century as well. Even the way we understand ancient literary works and how they should be viewed in relation to the textual history of the Hebrew Bible. The textual history of Jeremiah is a clear example of how the discovery has shed new light on the textual evidence. As a result, scholarship has had to change its approach to the evidence, particularly with regard to the application of different types of literary evidence. Textual history should no longer rely on the Masoretic text as the focal point of research, and it should not be limited to the scope of a single literary work. All interrelated texts should be taken into account to explore their genealogical interrelationships. And through this process, it is possible to see the complexity of textual history to the fullest extent. Thank you.